Events in South Carolina would soon light the fuse of conflict.
One of the first things that the state did was they took control of Castle Pinckney, a small little fortress in Charleston Harbor. It was basically, there was about 20 workmen working on the facility, and a sergeant and his family guarding at caretakers. No problem, no blood spilled, anything. Some say that was the first act of the Civil War. Meanwhile, not that far away on Mount Pleasant, on the Sullivan's Island, was Fort Moultrie. That was commanded by Major Robert Anderson, a Kentuckian who at one time had owned slaves. And that is why he was named in part to the fort, for fear that if the South succeeded, then he would be sympathetic and surrender. Turned out he did. He was a very dedicated soldier and commanded his post. Anderson also holds, in my opinion, one of the most unique distinctions of the war. He's probably one of the few major figures that was clean-shaven.
The newly formed Confederate government sent its first general officer, P.G.T. Beauregard, to take command of Charleston's defenses.
In one of those many bizarre coincidences you find throughout the war, Beauregard and Anderson were actually close friends at one time. Anderson had been Beauregard's artillery instructor and had basically become his mentor while Beauregard was at West Point. And the correspondence between him and Anderson was extremely polite and extremely courteous. I suspect it really hurt Beauregard on a personal level, but he, being the good soldier, did what he was due. Anderson was in a very not a good position. Moultrie was designed to defend the harbor, not defend against a land invasion. Sand dunes have walled up against the fort to the point where you could literally walk from the beach up the sand dune to the top of the parapets. There are also houses around the fort, still to this day in fact, that look down on the fort, so Confederate sharpshooters could easily have attacked the fort. Anderson was aware of this, so on the day after Christmas, 1860, December 26, he and his men, in secret, only he and one or two trusted officers knew this, boarded from Moultrie to Fort Sumter, which totally outraged and angered the Confederate government both in South Carolina. And at the point in the time, Anderson, he could still go into Charleston and buy food for his men, but soon they were cut off from supplies. It was whatever they had, they took with them.
The Star of the West, a merchant steamship hired by the federal government, was sent to supply and reinforce Anderson. South Carolina cadets fired on the ship, causing it to abandon its mission.
Confederates got impatient. There was in early April, Beauregard sent some representatives to the fort to negotiate. They talked for hours, and Anderson said, well, give me till April 15th and then we'll evacuate because we'll be out of supply. His officers were totally against any evacuation. Two of them are noteworthy. One was a lieutenant named Jefferson C. Davis, no kin to the president, but later he would come back to South Carolina as the commander of the 14th Army Corps as Sherman marched through the Carolinas. The other was Captain Abner Doubleday, who for years was erroneously credited as the inventor of baseball. So they decided, they took the terms back to Charleston. They wrote back saying, we've been ordered to start, and the note was dated about 3:45 a.m. and said, we've been ordered that within 1 hour you'll receive this note to start fire unless you surrender. And sure enough, about 4:30 in the morning, there's some debate on the exact right time, right where we are at Fort Johnson, the shelling began on Fort Sumter. The first shot, many people describe looking like a magnificent palmetto tree when it exploded over the fort, although many believe that was just maybe a little bit hyperbole. However, a more logical and accurate description said that it was so bright it lit up the whole fort, and the shelling continued. Interestingly, Anderson did not return fire at first. When they got up at 7 o'clock that morning, he had all his men eat breakfast, then they started firing. Tradition holds that the first shot fired in retaliation was by Abner Doubleday, and they continued shelling for several hours a day, and then Anderson realized that he was running out of ammunition. Now, also worth noting is that when Fort Moultrie fired upon Fort Sumter, it marked the first and perhaps the only time in the history of recorded warfare that two masonry forts actually fired on each other. At 7 o'clock that night, 34 hours roughly after the battle had begun, the fort was surrendered. There was no casualties. Some significant damage to the fort. A lot of the wooden structures inside the fort were destroyed. Beauregard was very gracious in his surrender. He allowed them to leave with full military honors, carry all their personal belongings. Unfortunately, there was an accidental explosion in his powder room that killed one person. That was the only casualty. And really, when you get down to it, given all the politics, all the drama, everything that happened, the Battle of Fort Sumter is really almost anticlimactic when you think of, especially compared to what would go on later. Basically a bunch of forts fired upon one fort, and then after about a day and a half, they called it quits. And that's pretty much that's a whole story in a nutshell, really.
After the fort was forced to surrender, Lincoln declared a blockade of the Confederacy's coast and called for 75,000 volunteers to quash the rebellion. North Carolina Governor John Ellis's response to Lincoln's call for volunteers was,
"I can be no party to this wicked violation of the laws of the country and to this war upon the liberties of free people. You can get no troops from North Carolina."
Virginia, Arkansas, and Tennessee would soon vote to secede. With its neighbors joining the Confederacy and conflict nearing the inevitable, the Tar Heel state would soon join the independence movement. A fight that most people, both Northerners and Southerners, thought would be over quickly would last 4 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives.